So welcome everyone to the session of the Leuven seminar. Today we discuss the pre-circulated paper by Stefan Lang titled Reinhold's Deduction in Beiträge 1. But before I introduce the speakers to you, I would like to kindly ask all the participants to switch on their cameras, if possible, of course. There is no obligation, but it will be nice to see each other. And I would also like to mention that after the official session, we will keep open the Zoom meeting for more informal conversations. So you are, all, of course, all invited to stay for an informal chat. And I will say a few things about the structure of today's session. So we will have a short introduction by Stefan Lang on the content of his paper. Then we will have a response by our second speaker of today's session, namely Elise Peketic. And then we conclude with an hour or almost an hour of discussion of Q&A, and you will have the chance to ask your questions. So let me now introduce to you the speakers of today's session. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Stefan Lang. Stefan Lang is Privatdozent at Martin Luther Universität Halle-Wittenberg. His research focuses on the theory of subjectivity and on classical German philosophy. I'll mention a couple of his most recent publications, which include a monograph titled Phänomenales Bewusstsein und Selbstbewusstsein, idealistische und selbstrepräsentationalistische Interpretationen, published by Miner in 2020. Stefan Lang has also published articles on authors such as Kant, Reinhold, Fichte, and Schelling. I mentioned one of his most recent articles on Reinhold, which I think is relevant for today's discussion. The paper, the article is titled Karl Leonhard Reinholds Begriff der Deduktion, published in Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie in 2021. And it is also my pleasure to present our second speaker of today's session, Elise Peketic. Elise is assistant teaching professor at Purdue University. She received her PhD at our university, KU Leuven, in 2019. So she was a colleague of us. Her area of expertise is classical German philosophy, especially Kant and Reinhold. I'll mention also a couple of articles of her articles. One is titled Reinhold on Intellectual Intuition, published in 2023, I think, as ahead of print. It's available online in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. And another one on Fichte, titled The First Principle of Philosophy in Fichte's 1794 Anesidemus Review, published on Fichte Studien in 2021. So I now give the floor to Stefan Lang for his introduction, please.
Okay, hello everyone. Stefan Lang. Thanks to Pier Paolo for the introduction. I would also say thank you to Karin and Luis Garcia for the invitation, and especially I would like to thank Elise, our respondent today. Okay, I have about 10 minutes, so I'll start right away with Reinhold on deduction, and I will touch two topics. The first topic, the paper you received from me is an excerpt from a book I'm writing. The book is about deduction in early German idealism. In the paper, I treat Reinholds Fundamentallehre in the first book of Beiträge zur Berichtigung bisheriger Missverständnisse der Philosophen. So henceforth I will only say Beiträge. And if I mention Reinholds Versuch einer neuen Theorie des menschlichen Vorstellungsvermögens, I will only say Versuch. And if I talk über das Fundament des philosophischen Wissens, I will only say über das Fundament, right? So Beiträge shortly. The first book of the Beiträge is probably Reinhold's most influential writing. When Fichte is talking about Reinhold in 1794, 1795, he has the Beiträge in his mind, or über das Fundament. As far as I know, the Fundamentallehre has not been translated into English. So in the paper you received from me, I did not presume that you are familiar with Reinhold. And that was one reason why I also talked a bit about Reinhold's Grundsatzlehre, his principles, and the concept of elementary philosophy. But this makes sense because if we want to understand Reinhold's deduction or his deductions, we also have to consider what he has to say about the principles and his concept of elementary philosophy. So in the book, the reconstruction of deduction has now about 70 pages. So I've sent a small piece of the reconstruction of the deduction just to give you some hints about the way I see Reinhold understands deduction. And yeah, that leads to the second topic. In the paper, I did not mention many important topics. And now I will list which topics are important, but I'm not discussing in the paper. Now, first of all, in the paper, I did not explain reflection and meta-representation. So Reinhold is not using only one method called deduction. No, he is, in German language, we would say something like Methodenpluralist, so methodological pluralist. Deduction is one method, and reflection is another, and meta-representation is another as well. In the paper, I did not talk about reflection and meta-representation. So the story gets even more tricky. There isn't the one deduction Reinhold is developing. There are different types of deductions. This is especially true when we talk about different writings. But the same is true when we think about Fichte. Fichte talks about deduction, but he develops different types of deduction as well. So in the paper, I focus on one kind of deduction. Reinhold is interested in his Beiträge. Second topic I did not address in the paper concerns Reinhold's account of clear and distinct consciousness. And that means I also did not say something about his account of self-consciousness, which is important if we want to understand the highest principle of the elementary philosophy. And strictly speaking, I also did not explain Reinhold's notion of consciousness, because the principle of consciousness or sentence of consciousness, the highest principle of Reinhold's theory, does not really explain what consciousness consists in according to Reinhold. So there's a distinction, a difference between Reinhold's concept of consciousness as such and what we learn when we read and understand the principle of consciousness. So a third topic that is left out concerns the relationship between Reinhold and Kant, Reinhold and Fichte, more or less. I just say a bit about Reinhold and Fichte. I did not say anything about Reinhold and German school metaphysics, and so on and so forth. But if you have read the paper of mine, I guess you already know how I see the relationship between Kant and Reinhold. As I see it, there are some similarities, but the differences are overwhelming. I guess this would be a topic we could talk in the discussion. So my thesis is that Reinhold's account of deduction is different from Kant's account of deduction. A fourth issue not addressed in the paper concerns objections to Reinhold's deductions. Reinhold's deductions have been sharply criticized. I defend Reinhold as best as I can. We all know how much energy is expended defending Kant and Hegel, and I guess we should also defend Reinhold just as seriously. But let me emphasize, Reinhold's deductions have the weaknesses. So I would say they are defunct. This does not work. But still, I try to defend him as good as I can. Final remark, when we think, for example, about Fichte's deductions also have the weaknesses. And I don't want to talk about Schelling today, but I believe Schelling's deductions have the problems. And when we think about Hegel theory has also problems. So just because Reinhold's deductions maybe have the weaknesses, does not mean that his theory is not interesting at all. The question is, what can we learn from his deductions, and so on and so forth. So that's it for my introduction. Again, thanks for having me.
Thank you to you for the introduction. So I leave the floor to Elise now.
Great. Thank you very much, Stefan, for this wonderful chapter from your upcoming monograph. So what I really appreciate about this chapter is its focus, that you focus on Reinhold's deduction. This is a refreshing and topic because it is not often a topic that's focused on in Reinhold scholarship, both during Reinhold's time as well as today. And so I think that this part of your monograph, and surely the monograph itself, will be a very important contribution to the scholarship on Reinhold and other classical German thinkers that you are speaking of in the book. I want to focus today on your thesis in this chapter. And your thesis speaks to those deficiencies in the deduction that you introduced just now. So your thesis is, as you state in the introduction, Reinhold uses axioms, which you qualify as laws, in his deductions without, one, thematizing these axioms, and two, without justifying them. So these seem to be your two main criticisms as to why Reinhold's deduction is deficient. So the axioms that you pick out are the following, and there are three of them. The first is the axiom of production, which you explain on pages 13 and 14 as the representation and its properties are produced by an activity. The second axiom is the axiom of capability. This you explain on page 14, and you explain it as capability underlying the production of the representation and its properties. Finally, the third axiom that you talk about is the axiom of disjunctive properties, which you explain on page 15, and you explain it as the representation as well as the faculty of representation have contrary properties. So your claim is that Reinhold presupposes these three axioms, again, problematically because one, he doesn't thematize them, and two, he doesn't justify them according to your thesis. So the focus of my questions that I turn to now are these three axioms. And my overarching question, so my first question just is this really such a problem for Reinhold? So is the fact that he presupposes these axioms such a problem for him? Does that render his deduction defunct, as you said in your introduction, that he presupposes these axioms? So the reason why I ask, is this such a problem for Reinhold, is because an axiom by definition is self-evident. And so if we get to call something an axiom, then it is already in some sense or another justified, either in construction, in a priori intuition, as Kant tells us, or just through experience. In some way or another, an axiom, by virtue of being an axiom, is already justified. And so your second problem that you're identifying in your thesis, that Reinhold doesn't justify these axioms, seems not to have the bite that you suggest in your thesis, especially when we turn then to one of Reinhold's criteria for principles of his deduction. So as you discuss in your text, one of his criteria is that both principles and concepts in Reinhold's deduction be allgemein geltend, or universally accepted. So if these axioms that I think you rightfully show Reinhold indeed presupposes are allgemein geltend, so universally accepted, then by virtue of being axioms, thus already justified, and by virtue of being allgemein geltend, universally accepted, it seems that that second part of your thesis doesn't hold anymore, that these axioms aren't justified because it seems, well, they are already justified if they meet that allgemein geltend criterion and if we can indeed call them axioms. So that's the first question, just overarching. Is this such a big problem? Because if we take away that Reinhold doesn't justify the axioms that he presupposes, as per your thesis, then we're only left with he doesn't thematize them. And I think anybody would have to grant that Reinhold is not the best or clearest writer, that he writes very concisely, that he doesn't explain all of his presuppositions, and that that's a part of the work of being a Reinhold scholar, is to add these things. And so that you add the presuppositions that he's making, I think is an important contribution to the scholarship, but far less problematic than him not being able to justify his presuppositions. So now I just want to focus briefly on each of the axioms that you talk about, building on that first overarching question. So let's focus first on the axiom of production then. You talk about how Reinhold presupposes this axiom when he posits the representing power or force as the ground of the representation. However, to presuppose that a mental representation is produced by a mental act, which is what this axiom tells us, is hardly controversial to my mind. It's been a common practice from philosophers from Aristotle to the Leibnizians to posit that an act is the cause of the mental representation. Even Kant, who is very careful about applying the categorical pair of cause and effect, is happy to accept that an act of judging is the cause of a mental representation of a judgment. And so it seems to me that this is a universally accepted axiom, meeting then that criterion of Reinhold for his presuppositions and principles, etc., that they be allgemein geltend. The second, turning now to the second axiom, the axiom of capability. You call the faculty of representation the ratio, or ground of the representing power or force, on page 20. Here, I'm interested in the relationship between that ground, the faculty of representation, and the act, so the power or the force, the representing power or force. The reason why I bring up this representation here is to get at whether Reinhold's presupposition of the second axiom is problematic. So it seems to me that Reinhold posits this faculty as the ground of the representing power or force, so the act, as the act in potency. So in order for us to be able to have this act, anytime a representation is produced, there also has to be the potential to produce this act. This presupposition, so this is what the axiom tells us, and Reinhold indeed presupposes it in his deduction. And so I agree with you there. But again, I'm wondering, is that so problematic? To say that there has to be the potential to act prior to the act seems a presupposition that most philosophers would be willing to make at his time. So therefore, again, meaning that allgemein geltend criterion for principles for Reinhold's deduction. Even, it seems, the the way that Reinhold does this would be acceptable by Kant. So going back to the relationship between the faculty of representation and the powers of that act, Reinhold doesn't say that the faculty of representation is the substantial bearer of that act, where the act would then be a characteristic of this substance. That would be a problematic presupposition for Kant. But for Reinhold, the faculty of representation is by no means a substance, and rather just seems to be the act in potency. And so the relation between the two is not a pernicious one that it seems that most philosophers of Reinhold's time would accept. So perhaps Reinhold thinking this is allgemein geltend, universally accepted, and therefore doesn't need to be justified. Finally, turning to the last axiom, the third one, the axiom of disjunctive properties. So I was convinced that Reinhold indeed presupposes the first two axioms that you identified, which I thought that was very helpful that you make those presuppositions explicit, because indeed Reinhold, being not the greatest writer, doesn't do that. But I'm not as convinced that he presupposes this third axiom. The reason for that is that I wonder if the principle of consciousness, his first principle, already does this work for us. We already have the distinctions between representation, subject, and object in the first principle, the Satz des Bewusstseins. And then you say that Reinhold requires this third axiom in order to be able to derive the characteristic of matter in the representation as given and form in the representation as produced. But I wonder if those two characteristics of matter and form don't rather follow from that distinction that we have in the Satz des Bewusstseins between subject and object already, as well as then Reinhold seemingly just using any common philosophical presuppositions of the time without explaining them. So that was my third question, which brings me back to that first overarching question. Is it so problematic that Reinhold doesn't justify these presuppositions? And is it really just the problem is really just that he doesn't make these presuppositions explicit? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elise. I think Stefan would have to say something on this. So maybe, Stefan, if you want to reply to Elise's points.
Thank you, Elisa. First of all, I'm happy that you defend Reinhold. So I totally support what you did in your response to my paper. I was expecting that you say, I don't think Reinhold uses axioms. So I prepared myself for today just to give you arguments which maybe convince you that Reinhold is using axioms. So now you say, yeah, but that's not a big deal. So
your chapter already convinced me.
That's cool. So I'm happy. Thanks. So we agree that at least Reinhold does not explicitly say I'm using these axioms. I just recently found a review from Schwab where he says, well, in this passage in the Beiträge, Reinhold says this or that, and this makes sense if Reinhold would also use an axiom. But Schwab is not quite sure if Reinhold really uses an axiom. So I guess this is a sign that the first reader of Reinhold's Beiträge were thinking maybe when Reinhold is presenting his deductions, he's using axioms without explicitly mentioning them. Okay, but your main point is, well, is it really that devastating if Reinhold does not justify the axioms he's using? I mean, there are many problems. First of all, it was difficult for me to, let's say, define the axioms. So how can we spell them out correctly, so to say? And I'm still fighting with this topic. And I guess if we have to say, well, we take a look at Reinhold's deductions, and it's hard to define the axioms, then that's a problem. So this would be a first thing that I would say Reinhold has a problem with using his axioms without thematizing them, because we don't really know how to define the axioms. And another problem is I'm trying to introduce a fourth axiom, which maybe will help to defend Reinhold to a greater extent than I can do right now. But this leads to the question, how many axioms are there? So I was expecting an objection like, yeah, Stefan, whenever there's a problem in Reinhold's deduction, you just introduce an axiom, right? So which axioms is Reinhold using? And how can we really say, well, this is an axiom and this is not an axiom, this is just a mistake in his deductions, and so on and so forth. Now, as I see it, when I go back to your criticism that it's not that devastating if Reinhold does not say much about his axioms, I guess we have to take a look at Reinhold's concept of Elementarphilosophie, or of a system of philosophy. Reinhold says we have to determine each concept. And we have to start from a principle that is universally valid, universally accepted. So the idea seems to be that each step we make in the deductions is justified. And if you just introduce an axiom without mentioning them, I guess this is this does not match his idea of the way a system should look like. So that would be my primary concern. When we take a look at the principle of consciousness, Reinhold has this account of reflection. But when he uses axioms, he uses them, he does not say much about it. So is this okay when we start consider Reinhold's concept of a system? I would say no, that's forbidden. So this would be my response to the first general question. And then I would have something to say about the three axioms. But before I do that, maybe Elise will, or someone else will join the discussion. Pia Paolo, shall I go on, or shall we just...
Maybe you first conclude, let's say, your response, and then we open the floor. And yes, I think it is better.
Then about the first axiom, this idea that if we have a representation, then we can say it is produced. You say, well, yes, representation is some kind of a mental phenomenon, so it's not that problematic when Reinhold says well, there has to be some kind of mental act. The story gets a little bit tricky if we take a look at the end of the deduction in the Beiträge, because there Reinhold again uses the axiom of production, and this time in connection with the meta. And his idea is, well, there has to be some kind of affection. And again, I would say he uses the axiom of production. And now we have the situation where Reinhold says, well, there is some kind of activity in the affection, and this activity belongs to the thing in itself. And this, I guess, is problematic. And this, I guess, is the sign that the axiom of production has a high price to pay. The price is that Reinhold can say there is the thing in itself that determines the content of the representation to a certain degree. And generally speaking, well, we are used to the idea that we have a representation. Well, the representation is the result of some kind of mental activity, maybe even the subject, but this is not without alternative. So I go back to an objection, I guess, Enesidimo Schulze raised. He says, well, Reinhold, you can say this is the effect, so this has to be the cause. There can be different causes for an effect. And one alternative could be, well, the producing force is God. Something like that, divine. To a certain degree, Reinhold wants to show that he has a theory which is not overthrown by skepticism. So I wonder, well, doesn't Enesidimo Schulze have a point when he says it's not that easy, mental representation, therefore mental activity? Now, about the axiom of capability, you say act in potency. That's helpful. I have to think about the relationship between the capability and the activity more closely, because Reinhold introduces the relationship between, or explains the relationship between the activity and the capability in a passage that's very hard to understand. He says the capability is somehow the ground, and the activity produces something in virtue of the capability. So let's say the activity just performs what is already there in the capability. Yep. I'm not sure if there was an objection against the second axiom I presented in the paper, so I turn to the third axiom, the idea that Reinhold uses the axiom of disjunctive properties or predicates. Now, you say, well, is this really an axiom? Can't we say this follows from the principle of consciousness? I'm not so sure, because with the help of the principle of disjunctive properties, Reinhold says, well, form is produced, so matter has to be given, produced versus given. And if we take the principle of consciousness at face value, it does not tell us something about something is being given or produced. Principle of consciousness says there's a relationship. And during the deduction, Reinhold says, well, I can show that the relationship or the relating of the representation to subject and object also means that the subject produces something, causes something. But this is a step, this is an insight we gain after the introduction of the principle of consciousness. So I would say we need something like the axiom of disjunctive properties. Otherwise, we have problems of understanding certain steps in the deduction, and the principle of consciousness is not enough, for example, to explain why Reinhold is justified in introducing the concept of matter insofar as it is given. So far, so good.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you. It was already a very interesting discussion, and I think it will even be better now that we open the floor to everyone. So please use the raise hand function to kind of be in the list of questions. Is there anyone who would like to start?
Yeah, I can't find it. I can't find it.
Okay, maybe Karin, you go ahead.
Maybe Timothy first.
Okay, Timothy, yes.
Thank you very much. I think this paper will be a really useful guide to going deeper into Reinhold. So thanks for writing it. This is just a suggestion or a question following from my initial attempt to use it as a guide. It's about reflection. And I have the impression, I wonder what you think about it, that maybe we can equate reflection with the deduction, and then even in turn with transcendental argumentation as you describe it. And I say this because, Reinhold describes his deduction earlier as something like, correct me if I'm wrong, but presupposing consciousness as representing, I will deduce the forms of representation without which we cannot have consciousness. And that seems like a transcendental argument. And then in the text, when Reinhold gives his principles, he'll say, just reflect on consciousness, and you'll confirm this principle. Moreover, reflection is contrasted to abstraction, right? So abstraction has all these sets of things given, and you can select from them. But reflection, right, is somehow a procedure to which you infer, something necessary, which seems like a transcendental argument, or maybe the kind of deduction that he does. But you very strictly separate reflection from deduction, which is very interesting, and I seem to see the reason why, maybe. But anyways, I'm interested in that, and I wonder what you may be able to say about it.
Well, Timothy, thank you so much, because I loved the reflection. For me, this is the best part in Reinhold's theory. So in the book, I write about 2 chapters about reflection. And Pier Paolo mentioned a paper I published some time ago about Reinhold and deduction, and there I say something about reflection. And what I say in this paper is, as I see it now, completely wrong. I totally underestimated Reinhold's account of reflection. Maybe what I say in the book will be wrong, and what I said in the paper was right, or maybe a different interpretation is correct. We will see. But having said that, Reinhold's account of reflection is super complex, has many layers. So I just give some hints. First off, why not say that reflection is the same as judgment? Some years ago, I believed that reflection is some kind of judgment. Now I don't think that this is true, because there's a passage where Reinhold says, it is possible to misunderstand the principle of consciousness, but it is also possible to understand the principle of consciousness correctly if you think and if you're reflecting at the same time. So reflection has something to do with thinking and judgment, but it seems to be the case that you can make a judgment and still do not understand the principle of consciousness because something is missing, and what is missing is called reflection. And in a certain passage, Reinhold says reflection is something that is immediate, and deduction is not immediate. So that's a problem where I would say reflection isn't the same thing as deducing something, because when you deduce something, you have an argument. So it can't really be something that is immediate. So nowadays, I would try to translate reflection as something like acquaintance. And nowadays, analytical philosophy of mind, I think about Ken Williford, who maybe reintroduced the concept some years ago in a paper called Rejoinder to Sahavi. And he says, well, acquaintance means something exists, it is represented, but it exists, and it is present before the mind. So it is really there for you. And Reinhold says, well, if we as reader think about the principle of consciousness and we reflect, then we really see the structure of consciousness. So reflection seems to be some kind of operator that makes it possible for us to get a grasp on the structure, to get an idea what are the really universally aspects of consciousness. And with the help of reflection, the structure of consciousness is for us evident, Reinhold says in a passage. So the way I see it, we have this kind of acquaintance, reflection, which is not the same as an activity where we have to do with some kind of abstraction, according to Reinhold, which is also not something like comparing stuff or so. No, you have consciousness before your eyes and you get an immediate grasp and you find, well, these are the most fundamental aspects of consciousness. And reflection as such is not enough for us to understand the principle of consciousness. We also have to make a judgment. We also have to think. And still one part is missing, and this is Reinhold's I would like to call it self-revelation of consciousness, because Reinhold says consciousness somehow shows its properties to us. They spill over, quillen. So we have three layers: judgment, reflection, and consciousness. Consciousness shows its properties to us, the right properties, when we are reflecting and making a judgment. And the reflection is some kind of acquaintance which has the capability to get a grasp of the right aspects of consciousness. And then we have a judgment, and so we can make a sentence called the principle of consciousness. And one more sentence about this topic, and then I finish. I guess it's also important to distinguish between the situation of the reader and the philosopher who develops for the first time the principle of consciousness. We as readers read the principle of consciousness, and then Reinhold says, then we reflect, and you have to think, and consciousness presents itself to us so that we can see, the principle of consciousness is universally valid, and so on and so forth. The situation is different when Reinhold as a philosopher for the first time introduced the principle of consciousness, because he cannot just read the sentence, reflect, think about it, and so on and so forth. Now, how do we get the principle of consciousness in the first time? In the first place, well, we need a concept called pure representation, and in a passage, Reinhold says, it was only possible to determine the concept of pure representation after we learned what Kant has to say about intuition, concepts, and ideas. Then we get an idea of representation in general, and then with the help of reflection, judgment, and the self-revelation of consciousness, which shows its properties, it was possible for the first time to formulate the principle of consciousness. And this leads me to another important topic, namely the question, what consciousness is Reinhold talking about when he discusses the principle of consciousness? But I stop here. Thanks.
Okay, maybe we'll leave this topic for later, and we move to the next question. Karin, please.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Stefan, for your interesting paper. I think my question is somewhat related to the preceding one, but focused more on the notion of a deduction in Reinhold. And in particular, I wanted to turn to your page 8, where it seems that deducing a concept is very similar, if not the same, as determining a concept. Yeah, so you write at the top that in the elementary philosophy, a number of further concepts are determined as well, etc., in deducing these concepts. Yeah, so in a way, the deduction, at least in this context, is very close to specifying what something is. Yes, maybe even defining what something is, and maybe that notion of deduction is somewhat similar to the act of deriving something from something else. But for instance, in the case of Kant's metaphysical deduction, the categories are not being defined. Yes, they're being traced to their source in the understanding, and their sum total is established. But Kant notes explicitly that they cannot be defined. Yes, maybe it's more complicated than that, but that's not part of what he does in the metaphysical deduction, at least. So is he using the term deduction for something like conceptual analysis that is aimed at the production of more determinate concepts? And if so, doesn't this make his projects kind of analytical? Yes, where we simply try to clarify what the features are of a particular concept, and that would be neither in line with the metaphysical deduction, nor would it be in line with the transcendental deduction. Well, according to you, that's probably fine, yes, because Reinhold is doing something else. But by using the term deduction, he does suggest a certain lineage with the critique of pure reason. So maybe these are already two questions: one on what does he mean by deduction, and isn't it simply conceptual analysis? And second, what's the relation between Reinhold and Kant in this relation?
Well, thank you very much for the question. As I see it, deduction means introduction and determination of concepts, new concepts into the theory. When I talk about the determination of concepts, I would subscribe to what you just said. It's some kind of conceptual analysis, determination of the features of a concept. But Reinhold also has this idea, I introduce new concepts into the theory with the help of axioms and principles. So it's some kind of heuristic procedure, so to say. You have a principle, you have certain axioms. So I can say, for example, the representation has to have two constitutive parts, form and matter. And then Reinhold asks, okay, how can we determine the features of form and matter, and so on and so forth. So, as I see it, Reinhold uses the expression deduction. So one would assume this is very close to what we find in Kant's deductions, and I doubt that this is true. There's a passage where where Reinhold talks about his relationship to Kant in respect to deduction, and he says, "I'm not happy with Kant's deductions." He uses concepts in the development of his theory without determining these concepts. And this is the reason why there are so many different interpretations of Kant's theory. And this is why many people believe Kant's theory is not true. So what I would like to do, Reinhold says, I want to determine the fundamental concepts of Kant's theory. So this gives a hint of what you called conceptual analysis. Now, but then Reinhold goes on and says, well, the definition of the basic fundamentals of Kant's theory, like, for example, spontaneity or receptivity, we can't determine the features of these concepts if we adopt Kant's method of deduction, according to Reinhold. So this is a hint that Reinhold seems to say, what Kant is doing when he's talking about deduction, well, that's okay. But if you really want to develop a theory that is about the fundament of philosophy as such, then we have to develop a different methodology. And by the way, when we think about Fichte, Fichte is also very unhappy with Kant's understanding of deduction. There is a manuscript where Fichte says, Kant's deduction isn't a deduction, that's some kind of rhapsody. So this leads me to another point. As I see it now, what Reinhold is doing is something new. Just as Elise says in a paper, Reinhold's system of philosophy is new. It's not really a scholastic or cosmopolitarian theory, it's something new. I would say what Reinhold is doing is also something new, but he's more close to German school metaphysics to a certain degree, or from Spinoza than to Kant. And so maybe it's important to think about the following. Until maybe 1785, Kant wasn't the superstar. There were other philosophers more influential, like Moses Mendelssohn and so on and so forth. And you find deduction in Wolff and so on and so forth. And when we take a look at what Kant is doing when he talks about deduction, it's something quite different. So let me say the anomaly is Kant and not so much Reinhold, in my opinion. So as I see it, Reinhold reads Kant and he says, Kant is right, but I want to lay the fundament of his theory. I need a method. Kant's method of deduction is not convincing. So what can I do? Well, deduction, there was Wolff and Spinoza and so on and so forth. So maybe I should go back, and if Reinhold reads Wolff or Baumgarten, and Reinhold knew German school metaphysics very well, then he sees, well, they have first principles and so on and so forth. But still, I would say what Reinhold is doing when he talks about deduction is something new. So I hope I did not miss a point, but that would be the answer to your question, Karin. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We move to Aaron.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for sharing this chapter. My question is about, it's very related to the previous question, maybe a variation on it even. It's just about determination in Reinhold as it surfaces in the chapter. So early on, I thought I understood what it means in Reinhold, or at least what the relata of the determination relation are, as you were mentioning. There's a sentence or proposition, a Satz, and then that determines a concept in this sort of definitional way. That's one kind of determination. But then later on in the chapter, there are also discussions where it seemed like different propositions were determining one another in a quasi-deductive way. And then finally, even more puzzlingly to me, there was this idea that representations in their form or their matter get determined, respectively, by the subject and by the object. So then that's yet another apparent case where apparently the relata are something different yet again. They're not sentences or concepts, they're the form of representations or the matter of representations, and these other entities, subjects and objects. So yeah, I was just wondering, purely out of curiosity about Reinhold, do you think there's a single sort of unified notion of determination going on, or should we be drawing distinctions between these different kinds of determination, or what do you think there?
I think you are muted, Stefan.
Okay. Thank you. It's obvious to me that you read the paper closely. I start with what you said at the end, that there is sometimes the talk of determination of concepts in the paper, and then determination of form and matter via subject and object. I shouldn't have said determination of subject and object. This was a mistake in my attempt to translate Reinhold. When I talk about determination, I basically mean determination of feature of concepts. And as I said before, introduction of concepts as well. So when we talk about phenomena like subject, I shouldn't say determination, I should have used another expression. Well, it was very difficult to translate Reinhold as a non-native speaker, so maybe you forgive me, this is due to my lack of competences in translating Reinhold. And yeah, I agree. There are different ways to determine the features of a concept. Sometimes Reinhold is using axioms to determine a concept, but not all the time. Sometimes he is using some kind of a transcendental argument, so to say, without also using axioms. So there's not the one methodological procedure to determine a concept and its features. This is maybe implicitly in the passage of the paper where I say Reinhold's account of deduction has 5 features. There is a sometimes he uses axioms, sometimes he uses transcendental arguments, and so on and so forth. But basically the idea is, yeah, Reinhold wants to develop a philosophical system that determines the features of concepts. And this is the job of the deduction. As I said before, the deduction also has to introduce the concepts in the first place, and then we have to define their features.
Thank you. The next on the list is Elise.
Great, thank you very much. So instead of continuing to focus on deduction and determination, I wanted to return to your response to my questions. And the first part of your response that I wanted to focus on was that you said that in presupposing the axioms that you identify, Reinhold doesn't match his idea of what a system ought to be. And this would indeed be an important criticism if it fit. But I wonder if we aren't then being uncharitable to Reinhold if we say that that fits. So I guess my question for you would then be, what does he mean when he says that the system, the Elementarphilosophie, determines each concept completely. So I agree with you that he helps himself to principles present in the philosophical dialogue. He helps himself as well to concepts present in the philosophical dialogue, like matter and form. But it seems to me that he tries to do so, he tries to integrate those principles like the axioms you identified, as well as the concepts like matter and form from the philosophical dialogue in such a way that they are determined completely by the principle of consciousness. And so when he says that the system of philosophy determines each concept completely, I think it doesn't mean that the system itself has to be the source of all of those concepts or their features, but rather that it has to tell us why a certain traditional understanding of matter or form is in a certain way correct and in another way incorrect. And when he then says this common understanding of matter is not the way that I'm going to understand it in the Elementarphilosophie, then he has determined that concept completely via his deduction from the principle of consciousness. And so it's not that, to my mind, that he has to be able to account for where he gets all of these features or concepts like matter and form in the Elementarphilosophie, but rather that he has to be able to account for why he keeps all of the features that he does of such concepts as matter and form. And then I think the charitable approach is at least to try to say the principle of consciousness and the steps between whichever concept is being introduced and it can do that work. But if that fails, then that's indeed a problem. The other point that I wanted to push back on with respect to your answer was how you referred to Nicodemus's, or well, Schulz's criticism of Reinhold, that there can be different causes for any given effect. And this is indeed right if we are introducing too many features of that cause when inferring from the effect. But I don't think it's right if we only infer the one or two feature of that cause that is absolutely necessary to bring about that effect. So when we infer to substance as the cause of a given effect, that would be going a step too far because it's not directly connected to an effect like mental representation. And that would be the same with your example of God. If we inferred that God is ultimately the cause of that effect, then that would be too many steps of inference away from the effect that we wouldn't be able to actually justify that inference by the effect alone. And so it's the direct connection between effect and cause in the inference that I think makes that work. And I think that Schulze misses that point with his criticism. And I think that Reinhold doesn't actually commit the mistake that Schulze is identifying. And I mean, Kant already, this isn't new with Reinhold, Kant already talks about this problem of inferring too many, being able to infer too many causes for any one given effect, and that the cause that we do infer has to be directly connected to that effect for it to be a legitimate inference. And I think Reinhold sticks to that legitimate inference. Thank you.
Nice, thank you. So you really defend Reinhold as best as possible.
I don't actually care whether Reinhold's right, by the way. I just think that it's very interesting as a intellectual exercise to try and understand him as best as possible. Because as you yourself said, it's so easy to not give him the credit that he's due because he doesn't explain nearly enough. And so it's easy to say, oh, he gets all this stuff wrong because he doesn't make it explicit. But, and so I think the fun of Reinhold's scholarship is trying to make all the points explicit, which I think is what you are doing as well, which I think is very nice.
Well, thanks. I mean, to me, it's obvious you have a different interpretation of Reinhold's account, which is fascinating. So we have two possible ways to see it, how we can understand, let's say, how we can judge the situation if Reinhold is using axioms. You say, well, that's not that terrible. I say, well, that's a mess. I have to think about what you said more closely, because I just prepared questions or objections where you say, no, he does not use axioms. And I haven't thought so much about why is it really problematic that Reinhold is using axioms without justifying them. So I see, I understand the way you see it. I see that's an alternative. And maybe I leave it like that for today. I have to think about it more closely, because I assume if I go on talking about this topic, I would start to repeat what I said before, and that's to a certain degree pointless. So thanks again. I will think about the question, is it really that devastating if Reinhold is using axioms? Maybe you convince me and I can say, no, it's not. That would be super. But I leave it like that for the moment. Now about this idea of the axiom of production. I like what you said. So you say Reinhold is only thinking about, let's say, the ultimate necessary parts we have to accept. So there might be much more to say about this activity, but let's just stick to what we can say right now. Okay, but what about the possibility that the representation is the product of the thing in itself, which is not some kind of mental activity, but maybe would be something Inisidime Schulze wouldn't find too absurd at all. So what would be your response to this reply to your proposal?
Yeah, great. I don't have a great reply because I don't have everything that Reinhold says about the thing in itself present in my mind at the moment. But my impression is that so I would have to look very carefully at the passages where he says that the thing in itself is cause, which I think is what you said about it, is the cause of the effect of given matter in the representation. So my impression is that Reinhold works the other way whenever he's talking about the thing in itself. And so he's not working from thing in itself to representation, but rather from given matter in representation out to thing in itself. And so to talk about given matter and to say that there has to be something that somehow is the origin of that matter is working from given in representation outwards. And or is at least inferring again from the effect there. And to say that there has to be some origin outside of the representation that's the cause of given matter, it doesn't really ascribe an activity to the thing in itself in the same way as Reinhold ascribes an activity to the subject. It rather, I mean, we could see it as a passive activity of receptivity that it receives something given, and then that there is still this distinction between receptivity, which is a faculty of the subject, and something outside of that, which is the source of given matter. This distinction so far seems unproblematic. And then just to say that we know not what, thing in itself is the origin of that given matter, seems again to me to be not ascribing to the thing in itself an activity, but rather saying that there must exist something outside of the subject that is the origin of this matter. So maybe I'm missing your point about where that's problematic, but it's, yeah, that's all I really have in my mind about that.
Stefan, do you want to add something on this?
Yeah, if it's okay, I
Yes,
would
sure.
read something. I mean, we were talking about the first time Reinhold is introducing the idea of mental activity as the cause of representation. So at the start of our discussion, we were not talking about the thing in itself and the affection. The thing I wanted to say is when Reinhold introduces mental activity for the first time, it's not intelligible why there couldn't be the alternative that we say, well, it is the thing in itself, right? In the first moment, we start to think about the question, what is the cause of representation? So then we can say, well, now we have a problem, because I can say, well, there is some kind of mental activity. Then I can say there has to be a capability of the subject for performing the activity, because now we are, so to say, on the side of the thing in itself as the cause of the representation. This would be, let's say, the second step in the deduction. Whereas in your response, you were talking about the idea of affection with the help of the thing in itself, which is maybe the ninth step in the deduction, or so to say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think I misunderstood your point then. Then I would just say that Reinhold isn't taking that step to thing in itself. So I think you're absolutely right. That could be, in actuality, the correct ontological explanation. A thing in itself could very well be the substantial bearer of these activities, as well as then of the mental representations. But Reinhold isn't taking that step. So his point is just to talk about faculties as a bundle of the acts in potency, without making the further inference to, well, what is the bearer, the thing that has that faculty? And so the faculty is, as I said in my response to you, to my mind, just the act in potency, without saying anything more about what it is as a thing, whether it's a thing in itself in the way that you just talked about, or whether it's God, or whether it's the soul of a human being. He doesn't make that inference at all. Faculty is, to my mind, just a bundle of acts, but those acts in potency, nothing to do with any further inference. And so, yeah, I'm happy to hear that Reinhold is wrong, but I don't see that problematic inference being made there.
Okay, I think we move to Louise.
Okay, so thank you so much, Stefan, for your paper and for the fascinating discussion. So my question is about the status of general logic for Reinhold. So how do you see it? Because at the end of your paper, when you discuss Fichte, You point out that this discussion on the relationship between a deduction and the laws it presupposes assumes the form for Fichte of a discussion on the relationship between philosophy and logic and general logic. And most of the laws that are presupposed or that Fichte thematizes as presupposed by the deduction are also laws of general logic, like the principle of non-contradiction, identity, and so on. So I was wondering, how do you see the relationship between these axioms that Reinhold is presupposing and general logic? And in general, how do you see Reinhold's approach to general logic? So how does he, does he go sometimes in a similar direction as Fichte goes to say, look, maybe philosophy should also discuss general logic, or does he make a clear distinction between both as Kant seems to do? So yeah, how do you see it?
Well, again, thank you very much. Fascinating question. Reinhold's take on logic is shaped by his discussion of first principles in the history of philosophy, at least in the Beiträge and in Über das Fundament des philosophischen Wissens. There Reinhold says, well, there have been philosophers who say the principle of contradiction is the first principle of philosophy, of metaphysics, ontology. And Reinhold says, no, that's not true. So he says, principle of contradiction is, if I remember it correctly, the principle of logic. And logic has to do with thinking, period. But it's not that we can say a principle of logic is also the principle of elementar philosophy, of the most fundamental philosophy we have. As I see it, for Reinhold, the laws of logic are laws of thinking and are not let's say suitable to be principles of the Fundamentallehre. All the principles Reinhold introduces in the Beiträge, at least, let's say, have some matter, some content. This is true in the case of the principle of consciousness, and this is true in the case of the principle of cognition. Now, what is exciting for me is that you said, what is the relationship between axioms and the principles of logic? Huh, this is a good question. Because now I'm also thinking about what is the relationship between axioms and the principles. So this is also something that is making me unpleasant. Elise, I come back to our discussion 5 minutes ago. Well, if in the deductions we have some axioms, we don't really thematize, we don't really give an argument for them, we just use them. And on the other hand, we have principles, where Reinhold says, well, we can gain these principles with the help of reflection and so on and so forth. So what's the relationship between principles and axioms and principles and let's say the axioms and the principles of logic? I would say Reinhold claims that the principles of the Fundamentallehre are the most fundamental principles of all disciplines, and that includes logic as well. So they're more fundamental, they have some material content. Yeah, maybe a historical remark, but a first reaction to Reinhold's theory, or one of the first reactions, was that philosophers said, look, you're always using the principle of sufficient reason, or you're using the principle of contradiction. And then Reinhold presents an answer where he says, yeah, but my principle is more fundamental than the principles I just mentioned. So I guess he would say, no, my principles, the principles of my theory are more fundamental. And I assume he has to say this is also true in the case of the axioms. But how do I know? He does not talk about axioms the way I'm doing. He does not thematize them, so I'm just speculating. But thanks for the question. Well, important one.
Thanks to both of you. So if there is no other question, I think Karin wanted to ask one question.
Yes, unless there's someone else who would like to go first. There's someone who hasn't yet contributed.
Yes,
So
maybe yes.
If I may, I can wait as well. Or
no, please go ahead, Manuel.
Well, thank you, Stefan, for your talk. I really enjoyed reading the paper as well. Just to follow up in Luis' question, actually, because if I understand you, your interpretation at the end of your paper, this distinction between logic and philosophy is what somehow separates Reinhold from Fichte and maybe from Hegel as well. I'm right in that. Is that your insight in this difference, that somehow Fichte is thinking on the logical principles as having a material implication in philosophy? Is that what you're trying to? Anyway, thank you for.
Yes, I agree. As I see it, Fichte uses laws. I call them laws, not axioms, because he tries to justify his axioms, and insofar as they are justified, I would say, well, then they are laws. It's a question if what I call laws are really laws or they're just rules and so on and so forth. And I would like to separate different types of laws Fichte is using, epistemological, metaphysical, and logical. But one type of laws are logical laws. The sentence, the principle of identity and the principle of contradiction. And there's a difference between Fichte and Reinhold, because Fichte says, yeah, the sentence of contradiction is not only a logical sentence, because with the help of the second Grundsatz of the Wissenschaftslehre, it is possible to ground the principle of contradiction and to show, let's say, some kind of mental activity positing or phenomenon that is really present there and corresponds to the principle of contradiction. So there is some, let's say, Fichte would say something like, look, there we have the principle in reality and not only in the dimension of thinking. At least that's the way I see it, and I guess Fichte says something like that in the Rezension review. And I would like to say hello, Esma. I missed you. Nice to have you here, at least if we can see you.
Hello, Stefan. I'm sorry, I cannot open the camera, but I try to listen to your talk. Thank you very much for your talk.
Sorry for the interruption, but
no.
Shout out.
Okay, I think we have 3 more minutes. If Karin, you have the question, if it is really short.
Yes. Okay. So I'll try to be short. Yes, but so I'm wondering if so how does Reinhold operate with the following distinction, or how does he relate to the following distinction? So in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, we find something like a metaphysical deduction of space and time, which is not called a metaphysical deduction. Then we find a metaphysical deduction of the categories, and we find something like a metaphysical deduction of the ideas of reason. But I think that Reinhold is also interested in offering us determinate concepts or deductions of a great number of other so determinate concepts of other features, which in the case of Kant belong to his language of instruction. Yes, for instance, affection, the thing itself, consciousness, object, and so on. So all of these concepts are part of Kant's language of instruction, and so are not deduced. Yes, and that was precisely what Kant was criticized for, that he introduced all these concepts and used them in a certain way without clarifying them. But so in the case of Kant, there is a very clear distinction between his maybe somewhat informal use of a number of concepts that belong to his language of instruction, and on the other hand, his attempt to offer a deduction, let's say, of the categories and the ideas of reason. And so do you find in Reinhold a similar distinction between, let's say, the task of deducing the categories, yes, or the basic concepts of our cognition of objects, and on the other hand, concepts such as affection and thing in itself and consciousness that that have a very different role to play? Or does he treat them on a par? Yeah, so is he deducing, let's say, causality in the same way as he's deducing affection, consciousness, and what have you?
Thank you for the question. I have to think about your question. But as a first response, I would say, no, it's the same kind of procedure, at least in most cases. So the way Reinhold introduces concepts like form and matter is quite similar to the way he introduces concepts like, let's say, affection or so. Maybe it would be better to parallelize, to make a parallel between spontaneity and reception and receptivity and affection. But I don't think they're that important differences in the way Reinhold is treating these concepts. What he's doing is sometimes he introduces some kind of Begriffserörterungen, conceptual analysis, which helps him to go one step further. For example, when he introduces the idea of the thing in itself in the first place, he starts with, we have an object if there is some kind of representation related to the object, and if we can say also the matter belongs to the representation in virtue of the object, then we can say, well, if we take a look at the object, if it's not in relation to the representation, then we can call it a thing in itself. So this is a different type of argumentative strategy when Reinhold introduces for the first time the thing in itself, with some kind of conceptual explanations. But I would say most of the time it's more or less one type of procedure where Reinhold does not only want to deduce unity of manifoldness, but when he tries to deduce something like concept or intuition, it's more or less the same procedure. At least this would be my first response to your question. And I should also add that Reinhold develops a deduction of categories, but not in the Beiträge, in the Versuch einer neuen Theorie des menschlichen Vorstellungsvermögens. And there his deduction is quite different from what he's doing in the Beiträge. So when we talk about metaphysical deduction in Kant and the relationship to Reinhold, I would say it's also good to take a look at the Versuch, because in the Beiträge, Reinhold is not really concerned with categories. categories belong to the theory of understanding, and in the Beiträge he's not presenting his theory of understanding, he's presenting his theory of representation and the faculty for representation in general. So the relationship between Kant and Reinhold is tricky, but I guess we all agree, at least when we say that the relationship is complicated.
Okay, so but very briefly, so this means that that also the way Reinhold proceeds in the Beiträge, and he calls this deduction, is also quite different from his own deduction of the categories in the Versuch.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's also a kind of illustration of your point that he's using various strategies, and apparently he calls them deduction.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this is a nice way to conclude at least our formal session. So let me thanks again Stefan and Elise. I think it was a very nice discussion, and me as a non-expert of Reinhold, I learned a lot, and I think also the experts of Reinhold enjoyed the discussion. And so thank you again, Stefan and Elise. And as I mentioned before, we'll leave the Zoom meeting open, so you are invited to stay for informal chatting. For those of you that have to leave, thanks for participating.